This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by AASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. This is one of the world-leading organisations for animal studies. If you're an artist, a student, an activist or an academic, you should think about joining. Membership is very reasonably priced. The episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a great collection of books about animal studies. It includes books directly relevant to the kinds of questions we'll be talking about today. For example, I simply have to mention Obaish, a hippopotamus in Victorian London by John Simons, which was released in 2019. Also a quick shout out to Elizabeth Usher, who provided the updated theme tune for Knowing Animals. To learn more about Elizabeth, visit veganthused.com. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to Professor Helen Cowie. Helen is a professor of early modern history in the Department of History at the University of York in the UK. Her work has a particular focus on the history of animals. Her books include the 2011 Manchester University Press monograph Conquering Nature in Spain and its Empire, 1750 to 1850, the 2014 Palgrave Macmillan monograph Exhibiting Animals in 19th-Century Britain, and the 2017 book Llama, part of the Reaktion Books Animal series. Today, however, we're going to talk about her book Victims of Fashion, Animal Commodities in Victorian Britain, which was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. Welcome to the podcast, Helen.
Thank you, Josh. Good to be here.
So what led to you working on fashion?
Well, I'm really much more interested in animals than I am in fashion. And I came at this by a fairly strange route, I think. So as you mentioned, when you were talking about the other books I've written, I started out looking at the history of natural history and the history of science, and actually looking at mostly animals as taxidermy specimens rather than living beings. I then moved on to look at the history of animals in zoos and travelling menageries. And it was while I was doing that project that I was searching the Times Digital Archive, and I stumbled across an article about a guy who smuggled some alpacas out of Peru to Australia in the hope of farming them there. I didn't have any immediate use for that article, so I kind of parked it for the moment. But it really did intrigue me and grab my attention. And later on, this blossomed into a project looking at the history of llamas and alpacas, and specifically efforts to kind of naturalise them overseas. Out of that, gradually, I kind of sort of transitioned into the history of animals as fashion. So I started looking at alpaca wool, which was used in things like jackets and dresses. And then I also began to look at birds' feathers, which were largely used on women's hats, and also seal skin. And eventually I also started to look at various other commodities, including ivory, animal-based perfumes, and exotic pets. So fashion actually isn't a huge interest of mine. I'm not a big fashionista. I'm actually quite puritanical in what I wear, which has partly been inspired by the work I've done looking at animals and how they're used by the fashion industry. So I've very much covered it from an animal rather than a fashion angle, as is probably obvious in the book itself.
This is a really rich book. As you were just suggesting, you talk about all kinds of animal products that were on the streets of Victorian London and around the world, and all kinds of debates that brewed around them. So let me first of all ask you about murderous millinery, the use of feathers and birds' corpses in clothes, and especially, as you say, hats. Now, I knew that Victorian women wore feathers, but I was blown away by just how many birds were being killed, how many different kinds of birds and how many individual birds were being killed for this trade.
Yeah, the quantities are pretty horrific, really. And this is also partly because obviously feathers are very light. You need a lot of feathers to adorn a hat in particular, but also dresses, shoes, all kinds of things. And that meant killing a lot of birds. I mean, the most, I think, disturbing example of this is the case of the egret, which is a kind of heron. You get them globally, really, but particularly in Florida and Venezuela. The feathers that people particularly valued were their nesting feathers, or so-called nuptial feathers, that they only get when they've just had chicks. So that obviously meant killing them in the breeding season. And then you have these really disturbing images of starving egret chicks that, their parents have been slaughtered. And again, they only have a couple of feathers for each bird, so you need hundreds of thousands of these. So yeah, the quantities are pretty shocking. They certainly shocked me when I was looking at it.
So, with the egrets and with other birds, these were mostly being imported from around the world. Is that correct?
Primarily, though there are also examples of birds in Britain that were sort of culled for various fashionable items. Robins, for example, they were also caught as pets as well for the pet trade. Some legislation was actually passed to protect these birds starting in the 1860s, but it took a lot longer to control the import of birds from around the world. And also people didn't necessarily know the kind of cruelty that was being perpetrated overseas because they couldn't see it.
But the people who were criticising this, something that I didn't know until I'd read your book, they were generally okay with some feathers, and quite specifically, they were okay with ostrich feathers. So what was it about ostriches?
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I didn't realise this until I started doing the research. So organisations such as the RSPB, which is very much formed to counter murderous millinery, they have particular sort of sections in their works where they'll say the ostrich accepted. You can wear ostrich feathers, but nothing else. The reason for this is that ostriches are domesticated in the 19th century, towards the end of the century, particularly in South Africa. So what that means is you don't actually have to kill them in order to get the feathers. Instead, you can pluck the feathers from the living birds. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that this is without cruelty, and there are a lot of fairly sort of tortuous debates about whether or not cruelty is perpetrated against the ostrich when you actually pluck the feathers. Some people claim that it's perfectly fine, it's no worse than shearing a sheep, although, in modern agriculture that can have its problems as well. But others, there's one quote saying it's no more painful than having your tooth pulled out without anaesthetic. So that's not great. But nonetheless, the species wasn't actually in danger, whereas for many of the other birds, these were actually going to go extinct if you continued to exploit them at the rate that was happening.
Yeah, so this became a kind of model for conservation almost. The idea was that we could save threatened species by domesticating them, by farming them and taking something useful from them. I mean, how serious were these proposals? How close did we really come to widespread farming of so-called exotic animals?
To be honest, most of them fail, actually. So, we've mentioned the ostrich, and that's, I think, a rare case of a wild animal being domesticated and actually bred in captivity, and that working on a large scale, which it does in South Africa. There are attempts, as I talk about elsewhere in the book, to domesticate other species. These include, at one point, the African elephant, which was going to be domesticated not for its ivory, but for labour. The idea being that if the elephant was useful as a labourer, then there'd be less kind of push to just destroy it if it was in no way useful apart from for its tusks. There were also efforts to domesticate the vicuña, which is a kind of wild alpaca that you get in Peru, and to breed it, to sort of shear it and to release it. Again, that doesn't work particularly well. They're still trying to sort of captive breed some of these animals in Argentina, but it's problematic. So this is kind of often a common model that people suggest, rather than hunting these animals, we can control them and basically farm them. But the reality is it tends to not work. There's a reason why animals aren't domesticated. It can be a very long, slow process taking centuries. And some animals are just not suited to it. They become diseased, or often they try to move them to other countries and domesticate them there, but you have issues with climate and various other problems. So it's interesting that the Victorians keep coming up with this as the solution, but it's not really a solution, and it's not really a solution today in most cases either.
I suppose when we think about this, crossing animals across borders or domesticating these wild African animals, you can clearly see the colonial element to what's going on here. And I suppose the reason that you're focusing on Victorian England, or the reason there are these questions arising in Victorian England, is so much because of the globalization of trade in that era.
Absolutely, and I think that's key to why there are so many animal products being imported and being used. So obviously there are examples of animal commodities being traded globally in an earlier period. Things like beaver fur is important in the 18th century as an earlier kind of colonial venture. And you have things like obviously the silk trade much earlier on between China and Europe. But what's different in the 19th century is really, well, it's industrialization, it's steam shipping, it's new manufacturing processes that make it easier to incubate ostrich eggs or dehair seal skins, and you can really then produce these items at a large scale, and that does then give rise to trade across the world. So you have egret feathers coming to London from Venezuela. You have birds of paradise coming from Papua New Guinea. You have fur seals coming from Alaska, elephants from mostly Africa, some from Asia as well. So it does really enable that, and obviously the consequences in ecological terms are quite devastating.
Final question about birds' feathers. Something that struck me, and I suppose this isn't unique to bird feathers within the book, but it really struck me in the birds chapter, is the fact that this is a very gendered trade. Although it's mostly men who are killing the birds and making the clothes, it's mostly women who are wearing the clothes. And indeed, it seems to be mostly women who are opposed to the clothes.
Yeah, I think gender is actually pretty key in the fashion industry and in responses to it. Probably today actually as well, but certainly in the 19th century. I think in terms of who was actually consuming these products, you're right, it's primarily women. Certainly feathers, that's mostly women. Again, there are examples of men who wore feathers, particularly in fact soldiers would often wear them in their hats until Queen Victoria bans that for humanitarian reasons. Things like sealskin as well were mostly used for females for things like jackets and muffs. Probably a bit of an exception with things like elephant ivory, which they were used for things like cutlery handles, billiard balls, which is definitely a masculine thing, piano keys, which could be feminine. So there's a bit more variation there, but very much these are seen as kind of feminine products. What that means is that often, as you said, a lot of the criticism for using these products is directed at women. So that's very gendered as well. Some of it certainly does come from women, which is significant. And in some cases, this is women who are kind of aware that they're being critiqued by men, and they want to kind of both, I guess, rehabilitate their own sex as well as actually saving the animals. And some people explicitly say that. So it's women kind of policing other women. The RSPB is founded by women. The RSPCA is mostly sort of the membership are largely women, although the people running it are male. So there is that kind of gender dynamic. You also see this very much in the kind of anti-murderous millinery propaganda. Often the sort of trope of the bad mother is kind of used here. So particularly with something like the egret, where the chicks are left starving after the parents have been killed, this is, people say, well, how awful would it be if, a female mother is consuming these products? How could she do that? How can she let that happen? Equally, women often were pet owners in this period as well, as indeed were men. But this comes up in some of the debates about sealskin as well. There's a poem someone writes saying, well, a woman will be appalled if her pug were injured, but she's happy to wear sealskin. So this kind of hypocrisy gets pointed out. And I said some women are aware of that too, particularly because they're often criticising other things like vivisection, like the trade in animals for meat. But they can then be kind of hauled up and said, but look at what you're wearing. It undermines them. So I think gender kind of filters throughout this story in all sorts of quite sort of different and sometimes conflicting ways.
There are certainly echoes of that today as well, in the way that certain animal campaigns come across as deeply sexist. And there's also these tensions about the role of women within animal activism, insofar as often the membership is made up of women while the leadership is made up of men, exactly the same as what was going on there. Do you think there's direct analogies in what you're looking at there to these contemporary debates? Or do you think there's something slightly different going on?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are sort of lots of analogies, both in terms of gender and more widely in terms of how we try to protect animals today, in terms of the humane movement and its sort of composition. I mean, I think it is true that, again, certainly things like vegetarianism seem to be more common among women. Fashion, obviously, is something that, I mean, actually men can be involved in fashion too, but it's seen as kind of a feminine pursuit. So I think there are elements of that still, and some of it I think is quite gendered. I think also sometimes in a negative way. I mean, I think a lot of this is perhaps slightly more true of the 19th century than now, but I don't think it's gone away. Sort of the idea that often women opposing cruelty to animals are being sort of overly emotional or overly sensitive. And indeed, you find it actually, I think you find this most strongly in some of the anti-vivisection debates in the 19th century, which is a bit of a tangent to the book. But, women are accused of, not really understanding things. Obviously just women, being too sentimental. And so you actually explicitly get women, people like Louise Lindaf Hagby, who does feature in the book as an opponent of murderous millinery and other things. But she very explicitly tries to write in a more sort of impartial way, a more neutral manner, almost more sort of scientific, to kind of get away from these kind of sentimental considerations. So I think you do have that. And I think that, again, there's probably an element of that today, kind of the images of the mad cat lady. I'm probably one of those. So I think gender still features, hopefully a little less and toned down somewhat, but I'm not sure it's completely different.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned vivisection and this kind of scientific language, because that's another recurring feature of the book, is the kind of uses and abuses of science and scientific expertise. I was really struck in the conversation about seals, for example. Again and again, you've got scientists going out doing surveys and analysing behaviour and using quite advanced scientific methods and contributing in a big way to the debates about conservation and about cruelty in the seal trade.
Absolutely. I mean, science is kind of one of the themes that I guess runs throughout the book, because I think science and technology are kind of key throughout the fashion industry in both positive and negative ways. So certainly the angle you're talking about is more sort of naturalists going and, in this case, studying the fur seal population, trying to count them effectively. So what impact is the trade having on them? Also trying to work things out, like, if a female seal is killed at a particular age, can its pup sort of fend for itself without her milk? Those kind of questions. So you get quite a lot of detail on that. The same happens with other species as well. This might be thinking about how you acclimatise an animal, studying an animal in a zoo. Sometimes it's also about trying to sort of bust some of the myths that are perpetrated by particularly the millinery industry. So they make all these kind of wacky claims about particularly egrets, again, that, they just molt their plumes naturally, and an Indian paddles through their nests in his canoe and picks them up. This is not true. And you get scientists on the ground sort of saying, well, this isn't the case, and trying to provide lots of testimony. Or indeed, sometimes actually trying to test animal products to see if they've been adulterated. Are they real feathers? Are they real ivory? So all of that kind of factors in. You also, though, do get scientists disagreeing with one another. And again, this is true today, of course. There are debates on how do we best conserve certain species, what should and shouldn't we do. And again, I think that's particularly strong in the case of the fur seal. So you get kind of essentially two groups of American scientists. One of them effectively want to carry on killing the seal, but only on land where this can be kind of monitored, and you can only kill the male seals and sort of keep the population in check. And there's another guy who thinks that should be banned, and they kind of come up with different rationales for this. But it's all sort of supposedly supported by scientific evidence. So this is all quite masculine, the way this is done. And I mean, I guess I would say the conservation movement, which starts to arise towards the end of the 19th century, is broadly a masculine thing. I can't think of many women involved in that. They probably weren't allowed to be involved. And indeed, a lot of them are kind of big game hunters. On the other hand, the humanitarian movement tends to be more dominated by women, a bit more of a domestic phenomenon. So I think there are sort of interesting parallels between the two, really.
So what was the relationship between these movements? You've got conservationists and you've got humanitarians who are very concerned about seal slaughter for slightly different reasons. Were they seeing eye to eye? Were they communicating?
I think they're communicating to a degree, and I think on some issues they're seeing eye to eye. And I think this is probably also actually still true today if we look at those two movements. So again, to take the case of the seals, effectively you've got various different positions. One is to continue exploiting the seals and to kind of keep them for utilitarian purposes. So these people aren't really too worried about killing seals. They're not too worried about individual seals suffering, but they do worry about the population. And there's another, and this is still within the conservation movement, really a group of people who kind of say, actually, it's just important to keep the seal because, seals are a valuable species. We have a kind of right of stewardship over them, and we should maintain them. And people say similar things about elephants and other species. So it's kind of species preservation for the sake of the species, although you could argue that's really still for the sake of humans who, for their own reasons, want to keep the species. The humanitarians, it's more about the suffering of the individual. So there's a guy who writes a pamphlet about the fur seals called Joseph Collinson, and he is very much worried about the suffering these animals experience when they're being killed. There's sort of these allegations of seals being skinned alive, which may or may not be true. So they would want to halt the killing altogether, or at the very least he suggests that they should send over someone to kind of survey the slaughter to make sure that the most humane day methods are being used. So you've got these kind of different positions. And I guess I'd say that in many cases there is agreement. Everybody wants to, preserve these animals, and stopping hunting, stopping poaching is a good thing, whether you're worried about the individual, whether you're worried about the species. But there are cases, as I've said, where they disagree about whether you should or shouldn't kill animals that are not endangered, for example. So the conservationists wouldn't be worried about killing a cow, for instance, because there are loads of cows. So I think that's where you get these confrontations. And as I said, I think they're still quite, maybe even more pertinent today in many ways.
There's another area of science that you look at in chapter 3 on elephants. I was absolutely fascinated by the early efforts you talked about to find a substitute for ivory so that knife handles and billiard balls and piano keys and all the rest could be made without the need to kill elephants.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of the sort of science will save us angle, which I think we still see a lot of in contemporary sort of climate change discourse. But yeah, they try to find various materials. So basically, you don't actually give up the kind of consumer goods you're enjoying, but you can just make them out of something else. And they try various things in this regard. So on the one hand, they use other sorts of animal ivory. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be acceptable from a humanitarian perspective, but it might be from a sort of preservationist perspective if those animals are less scarce. So these include things like hippopotamus ivory, which is used to make things like false teeth, also narwhal ivory. And they also look at the kind of ivory from dead mammoths as well. So this is animals that died, thousands, millions of years ago, particularly along the Lena River in Siberia. And again, you can use their ivory. Again, that goes a certain way towards fixing the problem. Mammoth ivory, I should say, is still quite problematic today. There are debates about whether we should or shouldn't use it, because is it just facilitating the ivory trade? Another option is you use kind of plant-based ivory, and I didn't know about this until I researched the book, but there's a kind of nut called the tagua nut, which grows particularly in Colombia and Peru, and you can make little kind of items out of this. I've actually got a little polar bear-shaped item that I think I bought at the British Library some time ago. The problem with that is it's quite small, so you can make things like buttons, but you can't really make a knife handle or things like piano keys. What then really starts to happen towards the end of the 19th century is kind of synthetic substitutes for ivory. So celluloid is an early example, which is partly effective, but it's also quite flammable, quite dangerous actually. And then things like bakelite and eventually plastic. And in many ways, I think plastic probably saves the elephant more than all the other things people are doing, because again, you don't actually have to give up ivory. You can have the same resources, but made from something else. So yeah, I think this is more of a technological element to this, which is very important.
In chapter 5, you talk about a load of very strange different items that were in use and different trades that people might not have heard of. But one thing that really stuck with me was the fact that in the 1820s, a businessman was literally raising and slaughtering bears in London. What was going on?
Yeah, you wouldn't expect that, would you really? I mean, I think this partly shows, as other scholars have shown, just how prevalent animals were actually in cities like London in the early 19th century and beyond. We perhaps think today, there's not that many animals in the city, apart from at the zoo maybe, but apart from the pigeons, of course. But actually there would be lots of horses, lots of cows, lots of pigs. Yeah, you wouldn't expect bears though. That is a different level. The reason for this was these animals were being slaughtered for a product called bear's grease, which was used effectively as conditioner in the hair. That was essentially its job. This was a kind of a period where people had stopped wearing wigs, partly because it was difficult to get wig powder during the Napoleonic era. So they'd kind of transitioned to having their hair naturally out. So you needed to, in some way, condition it. I mean, I actually sort of dread to think about how people looked after their hair in the past, and people have written really interesting books on this. But yeah, to get bear's grease, you needed bears. You could import it from Russia, which is where most of the bears came from. But the problem was that a huge amount of it was adulterated. It was often hog's lard, or it was, in one case, it seemed to come from dogs that had been killed in the baiting pits, all quite grim. So the purpose of having these bears actually in these buildings was that you could sort of publicly slaughter the animal and people would know where their bear's grease came from, which again is pretty distasteful in many regards. But that was why they were actually in the property.
And what were the other ingredients you were looking at? Musk was one of them. I remember that.
Yeah, it was animal-based perfumes, really, which were quite popular, certainly sort of in the Georgian period. They become less so after about 1850. So musk is one of them. This comes from a deer, mostly in China and East Asia. Also civet, which comes from a species of, it's sort of a mustelid, it's a kind of carnivorous, sort of cat-like creature. This came partly from Asia, partly from particularly what's now Ethiopia or Abyssinia. And the other one is ambergris. This comes from Wales, and I don't think I've ever actually smelt ambergris myself. I should have done that as part of my research. But it's supposed to be very pongy, effectively. But it was used as a fixative for a lot of other perfumes as well. And this didn't necessarily entail actually killing the whale. This is a substance that they think it comes from sort of cuttlefish beaks that weren't properly broken down inside the whale. They may sort of kill it from disease. And then the substance kind of floats to the surface and people can pick it up on the shore. So yeah, all of these things were used in perfumes, which again, I don't think I realised until I did research for the book.
Let me ask you what is a difficult question, but has to be a recurring question for animal historians, which is, how did you include animals' voices in this story? Or could you include animals' voices in this story?
It's a really good question, and it is a challenging one. I mean, I tend to think generally with animal history, it's difficult to properly get at animal voices. I'm not sure I'm pretending that I have done actually in this book. I think what I probably am getting at is how humans thought animals thought. That's probably as far as it goes. You know, people attribute certain emotions to animals, and you do get examples of that. You can perhaps find examples of animals having at least a degree of agency in this process. Often, though, that is kind of almost biological agency. So, you know, you try to acclimatise an alpaca in Australia, but it dies, you know, and in a way it's prevented humans doing what they wanted to do. Equally, things like, you know, animal reproduction rates have a big impact on the effect of hunting on species. So things like elephants, you know, if you kill them, it takes a very long time to replenish the population. That's slightly different with things like alpacas and vicuñas, which breed more quickly. Again, that's not really deliberate and conscious on the part of the animal, but it does have a big impact on how they are farmed or how they are killed and how they survive or not. I mean, you do find examples of sort of animal voices or reported animal voices, and that's probably as far as I think I can claim to have gone. So I think one of the examples I give in the book is an alpaca that's been shipped to Australia. It's obviously very unhappy and thoroughly miserable, and one of its shipmates has died, and it's giving these little kind of plaintive moans it's describing as doing, and another one spits at somebody. So again, you can sort of see a level of animal resistance there. I mean, the funniest thing, although probably wasn't very funny for the animals, is that you got lots of reports of what parrots happen to say to their owners, particularly in adverts. People are trying to sell their parrot and, you know, say all the things that it could utter. So there's quite a few interesting things there. So we know what parrots regurgitated, I suppose. And you do get sort of fairly positive descriptions of certain animals, individuals, particularly this is animals in zoos. Also for Asian elephants that they try to acclimatise in Africa, they're all named and they're kind of given certain amounts of character, described as, again, resisting in certain instances. So I think I can go that far. I don't know if I would fully claim they're not really animal voices. I probably haven't gone that far with it. That is always a big challenge with animal history, and I know people are, you know, pioneering some really interesting methodologies that are going further than I have done. But it's something I want to do because fundamentally I care about animals.
What's the legacy of the animal products that you're talking about in this book? And I realise it's a big question because you talk about a lot of different products. But to start with, for example, if I go into a fancy barber shop, could I find bear's grease?
I hope not. I think that would be pretty unlikely. That goes out of popularity certainly by the middle of the 19th century, and I think actually a change in taste is probably the main reason many of these products stopped being used. We'd like to think it was campaigns and substitutes, and sometimes it is, but in that case it's not. So no, you wouldn't find that. You do still find some products, so things like musk, for example, and civet. They are still farmed, I mean, in much lower quantities, and there are ways of, you know, making synthetic musk, but some people kind of still like the real thing. So the absolute most expensive perfumes probably would still contain musk. Ivory, obviously, sadly, is still very much with us today. Less so in the Western world. It's now become much more sort of associated with East Asia, obviously building on the legacy of what the West did before. So that's still very much there. Again, and obviously you do still find it in Britain, not so much in fashion, not so much in, you don't have cutlery handles made of ivory, but these products still exist. I mean, I think I used to have a piano that had ivory keys, obviously very much secondhand. And there've been big debates about, you know, what do we do about antique ivory? Is it okay to trade it? You know, and what impact that has, which I think is an interesting debate in itself, really. What do you do with dead animals? Is it better or worse to sort of use them? But that's a different discussion that we may or may not get back to. But yeah, other products. I mean, feathers are still used in various parts of the world. Ostrich feathers absolutely are still used, although ostriches are more farmed now for their hides, and actually weirdly for things like their tendons and their corneas, which are used in medical procedures, which again I did not know. Fur seals, not so much hunted. but you still have the kind of annual seal cull of sort of harp seals on the coast of Canada, which raises a lot of contentions. And fur still is farmed, again, not so much seals, but things like mink. There was a big issue recently in Denmark in the COVID pandemic when a lot of the mink caught it and were culled. And again, I think that raises all kinds of issues, probably ethically, should we still use their fur? So a lot of these things, yeah, it still exists somewhere in the world and it's still used, often less so, and often we've kind of switched species. So most of these animals, I'm just trying to think through them all, most of them did survive the culling in the 19th century. Some of them are in a significantly better position today than they were. Some of them perhaps never fully recovered. Some of them did recover, but now we've started hunting them again. So I kind of think it's a fairly mixed picture.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that often we moved away from these products because of fashion rather than because of activism or legal pressure. If we are today interested in these kinds of trades, in the use of animals for fashion, whether that's clothing or whether that's other products, what value do you think there is in looking back to these historical practices of activism and these historical debates about animal uses for trying to make the world a better place for animals today?
I think that's a great question. And I think, it's complicated. There are some things that don't really translate into the modern world. But I actually think there's quite a bit we can potentially learn, because I do think these campaigns, yeah, partly it's change of taste is a factor here, but some of them do succeed and do have an impact. So again, if we look at the fur seal, you end up with an international treaty in 1911 to protect the fur seal, agreed between Canada, the US, Russia, and Japan, and that is kind of seen as a seminal piece of sort of maritime conservation legislation. You have similar sort of treaties or attempted treaties for elephants and other species. For millinery, there are attempts to stop the importation of plumage, and this requires a lot of negotiation, a lot of international wrangling. And I think we can learn something from that, actually. I mean, I'm talking to you while the COP negotiations are going on in Egypt. I'm not sure how well they're going, probably not terribly well, but these things like sort of reparative justice are important. So, for example, the US pay off the Canadians so that they won't hunt seals at sea. And you need to kind of pay people in that way. You need to do that. So there are lessons we can learn about that. I mean, that also, that the fact that international cooperation is essential, really. If just one country bans a particular animal, it'll be traded through a different country that doesn't. Equally, animals themselves clearly don't actually know where national boundaries are. So you might say that we've got an elephant sanctuary, but if the elephant wanders out of it and gets shot, that's no good. And they also learned very, very early in the sort of 19th century, you need to fund sanctuaries, you need to police them or it's useless. So I think all of those things kind of translate today from a sort of conservation perspective. We can probably learn something from humanitarian campaigns as well. And I think perhaps the biggest lesson there is that what's probably most effective in making people change consumer behaviour, it's often not statistics. It tends to be sort of individualising animals, showing their suffering. And there are some very effective examples of that with things like starving egret chicks, quite sort of emotive images that come out and get circulated. So some of those things can potentially have an impact today as well, I'm sure. And actually humanitarian organisations have learned from those and do use those sorts of techniques. So I think we can learn quite a bit potentially.
Now, Helen, I ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I think I am, yeah.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So I think the first example of animal history I've read is Louise Robins' wonderful book called Elephant Slaves and Pampered Parrots. I read this when I was an undergraduate and I was doing a special subject in the French Revolution. And this was kind of a bit of an outlier on the reading list. So I think I sort of picked it up out of curiosity. And it was just really interesting because I didn't really realise that animals could have a history. So I think that was one that had an influence on me early on.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
As I said, I kind of came to animal studies sort of by the back door via natural history and history of science. So I think the first things I started writing about animals were more about studying them, really. So in my PhD thesis, I talked a bit about live animals that were imported into Spain, including an elephant that used to apparently wander around Madrid and visit the fountain in the Plaza de Cibeles. And I talked a little bit as well in an article about a guy called Feliz de Azara, who was a naturalist. He spent about 20 years in Paraguay. He lived with the local animals and he wrote a big book about them. I'm not sure this is pro-animal per se, but it's certainly studying animals. And I think I start to look at animals in and of themselves in the next project when I started to look at zoos.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think, and this is probably unsurprising for a historian, Harriet Ritvo. her work is amazing. The Animal Estate was a book that I again read during my PhD and was really fascinated in, and it kind of really broadened my vistas, sort of showing how animals and human culture are connected. So I think, yeah, Ritvo is fantastic.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I think that's quite a challenging question. It obviously depends what your field is. So I suspect academics working, say, in conservation science or veterinary medicine, or sort of studying the welfare of animals in sort of factory farms or elsewhere, they can do more direct things to kind of alert us to the problems and to actually come up with solutions. I can't do that because I'm a humble historian. So I think probably what I can do is I can write about animals in the past. I can try and explore the changing human-animal relationship, and that can educate people who read the book, or my students perhaps most directly, and just get us to really think about that relationship. How has it changed? Has it got better? Has it actually got worse potentially? And I think also, as I mentioned, perhaps individualising animals, presenting particular case studies can make people actually really relate to creatures in a way that I think is important, and certainly is kind of how I got into animal studies. I mean, that said, I sometimes do just feel quite desperate and depressed about the state of the world, and think I'm going to jack it all in and found a pig sanctuary or do something a bit more direct. So I'm not always convinced how much difference I can make, but I like to think it changes people's attitudes a little bit.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
That's also a really tough question. I think in a general sense, according animals more rights and not always putting human rights ahead of animal rights. Very important as they are, it often feels that animals get marginalised, their needs sort of go to the bottom of the pecking order. I mean, I guess specifically, the thing I think is essential that we change is factory farming. I think that's really sort of the source of all evil in many ways, in terms of both the animals themselves in farms, which are treated appallingly, in terms of antibiotic resistance, which we're all sort of grappling with at the moment, and also in terms of the impact on wild animals, things like deforestation in the Amazon, which is again another really key issue. So I think if we could reduce our meat consumption, if we could really change our attitude there, that would be fantastic. I'm not sure you know much more about this than I do, but I'm not sure how close we are to doing that. I think maybe in 100 years, if the human race survives that long, we'll look back and think meat consumption was a terrible thing. In the next decade or so, I think there's a lot of resistance to changing diets, depressingly so, actually. We really should be reducing our meat consumption, if only for environmental reasons, and yet the governments hardly dare mention it. So I don't know. I'd like to see that change. I don't know if it will. I think it will eventually, but hopefully soon enough.
Yes, I think we're on exactly the same page in where we should be going and also where we are going. So I'm very sympathetic to what you say there. What is it you're working on next?
That's another good question. So I'm actually working on a book called, this sounds ridiculously ambitious, Animals in World History. I was approached by Routledge to do this. They've got a series called Themes in World History. So the idea is it'll slot in with that. It wasn't just a huge act of hubris from me. But the idea is that this will look at animals sort of on a global scale. So it would include thinking about sort of the consumption of animals, how that's changed over the years, thinking about animals as labourers, thinking about science and knowledge about animals, thinking about animals in zoos, companion animals, all of those kinds of things in a global perspective, which on the one hand, it is horrendously difficult to do. The big plus is I've really enjoyed having the opportunity to kind of read lots of other scholars' work, including people working on countries and periods that I don't actually work on. So it's great to learn about medieval pets. I'll give a shout out to Kathleen Walker-Meeklay's wonderful book on that. I've also looked at animals in China. Jonathan Saha's really interesting work on animals in Burma. So it's given me an excuse to read lots of great books, which is good. And it's also given me an excuse to probably really superficially look at some interesting animal case studies. So, I mean, I'm writing at the moment about, I don't know if you've heard of these, there's some basically wild hippos living in Colombia that were released by the big drugs baron Pablo Escobar. And there's sort of almost 100 of them now. And it's what you do again with an invasive species. That's my reason for looking at them. So yeah, I'm enjoying it. But yeah, 80,000 words is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, for the whole world and the whole of history, yes.
Yeah.
And how can people find out more about your work?
I mean, I don't want to flog it too much. They could read the book if they feel so inclined. I'm not that active on social media. I do have a website for the York University history page, which flags up a few things that I've done. I've done a few more sort of accessible things as well. So I did write a short article about alpaca smuggling in History Today quite recently. And I was also featured, I haven't actually listened to this, but I'm in a BBC Radio 4 documentary called Uncaged, which is talking about the history of the zoo. And it's a bit of a retrospective following the closure of Bristol Zoo back in September. So I think you can hear me allegedly talking about people feeding elephants wine in the Tower of London and other weird and wonderful things. So yeah, I crop up here and there.
Well, thanks so much, Helen, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you, Josh. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. And please do spread the word about Knowing Animals. If you're a teacher, for example, consider putting it on your reading list so students can listen in. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.